Hello, Tanshikia, my name is Faith, and today we're going to learn how to make an orange shirt pin. Now, in your pack you should have these things. First, pollen with an outline, some cardstock, some faux leather beads. You should also have some beads, E6000 glue, some scissors, and of course our thread. And lastly, our beading needles. So the first thing that you want to do is grab your thread. I'm using black thread, however you can use white. It's mostly your preference. You want to grab about an arm's length of thread. You should knot one side at the very end of the thread and leave a tiny little tail on where your needle is. First, you'll bring your needle through the pellin from the back towards the front. Then you'll place 2 beads onto your needle. Now you bring the beads down to your pellin where you line them up with your outline. Once you do that, you take your needle and pierce the pellin with your needle in the front of the second bead to tack them down. Now you bring your needle up through the back of the pellin and insert it just in front of the first bead you stitched down in the center. From here, you grab your needle and bring it through the 2 beads, essentially making the 2 line up and making it nice and secure. Now grab 2 more beads, place them onto your needle, bring them down to your pellin, and then pierce. Next, take your needle and pierce the pellin between the second bead. That's the one right before the 2 you just added. Pull your needle through, then you pass it through all the 3 beads, and you just simply repeat this process over and over again. And this is called the 2-stitch method. Now I'm going to continue doing the same process over and over again until I finish making the outline. Now keep in mind, beading has many different teachings. For me, I was taught to start from the outline, working inwards. This is the way many Métis have beaded for hundreds of years. There are also different techniques you can use, such as the 2-needle technique and the lazy stitch. I personally go between the lazy stitch and the 2-stitch method. I find the 2-stitch method very beginner friendly because once you understand the beginning process, it is the same thing over and over and over again. For beginners, spacing can be an issue with a lazy stitch. However, the 2-stitch method really teaches folks how to understand spacing and how to work with your beads, which eventually translates into the lazy stitch. Now, while we bead, I'm going to share some stories about my Métis settlement. First, also about my culture. I am Métis, specifically Red River Métis. On my mother's side, we got script in Round Prairie, which is a small Métis community where over 150 families lived. My family are the Troches. I'm the direct descent of Charles Troche, leader of the Round Prairie Métis, General Luriel's army, and leader of the Troche Buffalo Brigades, and one of my own personal idols. He adopted many Métis after the Battle of Batoche, which was in 1885 from May 9th to May 12th. This is also called the Northwest Resistance, where the Métis fought against Canadian armed forces to protect our land. After Batoche, my family had went into hiding into Montana, where many Métis leaders went to escape from the Canadian government. Later, my family got scrip in Round Prairie, which was our traditional wintering site. Scrip was essentially a piece of paper initiated from the Canadian government to appease the Manitoba Act, which promised Métis 1.4 million acres of land. However, it's important to note that many Métis didn't actually receive land or money for scrip. Unfortunately, many settlers ended up scamming Métis out of their scrip. This happened due to many Métis not understanding how to read or the concept of land ownership. On my father's side, this was the case. where my great-great-grandfather, Narcisse Larondel, got scrip in Edmonton. However, he was duped out of it. This happened to countless Métis in Alberta. In fact, the first millionaire in Edmonton made their wealth strictly on scamming Métis out of scrip. Now, back to Round Prairie. My family ended up moving to Round Prairie after going into hiding. However, the land was bare, there was no food, the bisons were gone, and my settlement struggled to live. In my great-grandfather's generation, the settlement sadly came to a close where only graveyards lay. This was due to the government and the Great Depression. Métis were not entitled to relief, which many Canadians were. We were not considered Canadian. C.C. Williams essentially referred to Métis being lazy, a problem population, and not deserving of relief. A Saskatchewan official stated to blame the breed. Thus, the era of road allowances happened to the Round Prairie Métis. Half of our Métis settlement passed away from starvation, and the other half had to make their way to Saskatoon to the road allowance. Road allowance were where Métis lived. This was where my great-grandfather lived. Essentially, we were not allowed to buy land, and so many of us lived in these areas where we stayed together to keep our culture alive. Road allowances were land set aside for the government's plan to build things for the public, such as roads, or trains, or public transportation, those kind of things. We squatted there and got kicked out a lot. On top of this, all of Round Prairie Métis mostly attended residential schools. Now, looking at something more fun for my settlement. Essentially, one of my favorite things that my family has stayed to stay connected to our land is that every year we've been going back since I was a child to place tobacco and sometimes harvest medicine from Round Prairie. In my family, we have a saying about Métis bannock, which honestly no other Métis I've met actually uses, but essentially it's icing sugar on fry bread and we eat it with jam. It's kind of like a pastry, but my grandpa would make it for my mom, which in turn made it for me, which I'm pretty sure comes from our Métis settlement. My great-grandfather Joseph was also famous as he helped build the University of Saskatchewan, in which he'd bring dynamites to blow up rocks. These same dynamites would sit in his truck where he had a drink at the end of the day. He also changed his last name 3 times, and Métis would do this back in the day because he would bootleg alcohol. And so my grandfather did that, or my great-grandfather did. Now for beadwork, in my settlement, from what I know, was mostly geometric. I only have one piece of beadwork from our settlement, and it's extremely beautiful. It kind of looks like a flower, which is very cool. Now, speaking of Round Prairie, there are some stories I've heard about the Rougarou, specifically from Nora Cummings, who was the last Round Prairie elder that's still alive. Rougarou is basically a bad spirit. They can shapeshift into anybody and all the things, but their ultimate goal is to eat your spirit. They will tempt you in multiple different ways. Now, New Year's for Métis were such a big thing. Essentially, every family would get together at one person's house and have a ginormous kitchen party. There would be jigging, and fiddles, and food. One such New Year, the fiddle player went missing at Round Prairie. There just so happened to be a new person who showed up and knocked on the door. He was completely decked out and claimed to be an incredible fiddle player. Immediately, he was brought in, and every woman was absolutely fascinated. Everyone wanted to get to know this new fiddle player. In particular, a certain girl caught his eye, and throughout the entire night, they laughed, they danced. She laughed and giggled and admired his playing, and he admired her jigging. The New Year's cake was cut, and the coin was found for next year's host of the party, and everyone celebrated and cheered. Afterwards, this woman and the mysterious fiddle player made their way out the door, and with one look, she was gone, never to be seen again.
Congratulations! You have now finished beading your main piece. Now we'll begin the second stage. First, you grab your finished beaded piece and cut around it with your scissors. Now I like to leave a small amount of pellin so I don't risk the chance of cutting my bead thread. I recommend keeping your scraps. We will be using this later. Now now you should grab your cardstock and a pen, and then I would like you to trace your beadwork. Once you finish tracing, you then cut the outline out. I like to cut the outline a bit smaller, just because later when I go to bead the edges, I don't want my needle to get stuck in the glue that's hardening. And just beading into glued cardstock can be relatively painful. Now once you finish the outline, what you could do is sign it. I sign this mainly because I want people to know who I am maybe 1,000 years ago and know that I designed this piece. I really wish I knew what my family members' beadwork looked like. Now, once you've signed your piece, you then should grab your E6000 glue and start gluing the cardboard stock to your piece. I use cardboard stock to reinforce the piece so it's not flimsy. Now, I like to use that leftover cardboard from earlier to just spread the glue all over my beadwork. Now from here, you place your outline onto the beadwork. You then grab your pin and start gluing the pin to your cardboard stock as well. I'd also like to note that after you put your pin down, E6000 takes a while to dry, so just leave your beadwork for maybe 2 to 3 hours to let it dry, so that way it'll be easy to attach to the backing. So from here, you grab your faux leather, and you just kind of line up the pin with the faux leather. Here I'm using a black pen to kind of mark where the beginning and the end of the pin starts. From here, I cut horizontally where I marked the dot. From here, I grab my glue and I start gluing the cardboard stock again. This is going to be for the faux leather to go on top of this. Now from here, you grab your faux leather and you start to put your pin into those folds or those cutted folds that you had made previously. From here, I like to grab those scrap pieces of paper and just make sure that, you know, it's fully through the leather, make sure it's flat, that it's not floating, those kind of things. Now, once you're satisfied, you start cutting the faux leather again, just around your beadwork. I would recommend not cutting super close to the pellin, just because sometimes when you put it together it can be outlined and you don't want to show the pellin's back. Now this is a personal preference. I'm just filling in the pellin here with black Sharpie. I don't like seeing white under my beads, and so I tend to, like earlier, fill in with different Sharpies. And yeah, I also will be using black thread to edge, so I don't like seeing the thread, and then I don't like seeing under the beads. So this is just a little trick that I do. Again, it's optional and it's your own preference.
Alright, so now we're going to be edging. So first, you grab your thread that is double threaded. You go through your pellin forwards. You would cut off the excess thread. And then once it kind of looks like this, you would grab one bead, put it from your faux leather to the front of your pellin, like so. Pull it on through. Careful for it to knot, and then you go from outside inwards, and your bead should be able to lie flat on the side of your beadwork. Now from here, you want to grab 2 beads, and then you would put it from the back towards the front of your beadwork. And what you're going to be making is sort of a tiny triangle. Now we call this the zigzag stitch. And the zigzag stitch you can actually see on a lot of traditional Métis beadwork. From here, you would go through that second bead, kind of leaving the first bead without anything or any thread going through it. And it should look like this. It should look like a triangle. And from here, you would just do the same thing over and over again. And I like to space it between every 2 beads. Alrighty, so welcome to the end of your pin. So what you want to do is you want to grab your last bead, and what I do is I put it through the first starting bead that we did to make like a tiny little triangle. And then now here I'm going to make a little knot. Once I've tied off the knot, I actually bring my needle up through one of the beads. And then I snip it super close to the bead. And congratulations, you have made your orange shirt pin. That's incredible that you've made it this far. Honestly, I hope you wear it with pride and just, stay deadly out there. And yeah, enjoy.